Hello and welcome to the Capital Call. I'm Quinn Millegan.
And I'm Drew Millegan.
We're brothers and managing partners of the Woodworth Contrarian Fund. And, cheers to consistency. Keeping it up.
Yeah, episode number 4.
And once
Got
again,
matching Celsius here.
one day they'll sponsor us.
Yeah, one of these days.
And in case you don't remember from the last episode, stay tuned till the end because I do have some interesting things to talk about on our end segment, This Day in Financial Economic History.
Yeah, as per usual, he's going to surprise me with it. I've intentionally been left in the dark.
Yeah, so that'll be interesting. But I wanted to start off today, famous quote by economist Keynes, in the long run, we're all dead.
Oh, yeah. It's a good bit of moral philosophizing there.
Right. But, and this, I swear, will lead into what you'd like to talk about, but I heard an interesting story the other day about so they're talking about the craziness of the political environment and so they were talking about Lyndon Johnson. You know, they're saying this is all unprecedented, but you look in history, some politicians have acted quite strange. In fact, Lyndon Johnson, when the Canadian Prime Minister Pearson, I believe, gave a speech in the 60s against the Vietnam War, he then walked over to him after the speech, picked him up by his lapels, slammed him against the wall, and he said something along the lines of, "Don't ever come into my house and shit on my rug."
Yeah, this sounds like LBJ. It was there's a reason that the same guy that wrote the Power Broker, great book by the way, hell of a read. As in it took a very, very long time to read, but that man's only written one full novel, and now he's into a multi-volume series just about LBJ.
Yeah. Hopefully it lives up to the first book.
Yeah, it's kind of hard when you write your first book and it turns into a cornerstone of American literature about New York. It's kind of hard to top. So this week, what a non-week compared to the prior weeks.
Yeah.
We've had putting on of tariffs, taking off of tariffs. There was like a 3,000+% tariff on solar panels.
3,453% or something stupid.
Yeah, once you get beyond like 300%, that's no longer a tariff. That's a I no longer want to trade with you statement. And I don't know where you're honestly going to get a replacement for that kind of production. Apple is already moving its production of the iPhone fully into India at this point. But those sorts of things take time.
I mean, it was already in the process, too.
It was. And, going forward, even if they take the tariffs off, I don't think businesses are going to trust going to China whole hog ever again.
Yeah.
If COVID wasn't enough to convince them to shift production elsewhere, I think the tariffs at this point are enough to do that. Now, we have started to see some earnings come out from companies, which have been thankfully relatively optimistic, although there's been a lot of guidance pulled for further on in the year, just because of the uncertainty. But
notably, United Airlines said, okay, if we don't have a recession and XYZ happens, we're going to do this. But if we have a recession and XYZ happens, we're going to do this.
It's important to have a plan.
But usually there's not those multiple scenario earnings expectations, which is interesting.
Yeah. If this did that, if that did the other thing, if the dollar did the other thing, it takes a lot of effort to have all these contingency plans. It's not good for business certainty. And it's interesting with the trade impacts because we haven't even it's been the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, and these trade impacts still aren't being fully priced in. It's only just now that you've started to get some companies reporting a little bit of the impacts of tariffs, and most of those were, pre-Liberation Day impacts that really were more weren't as substantial, I would say. And it's important to keep a note here. In order to get goods from China specifically, which now has like the 200% plus tariffs, it takes 25 days for those goods to get to the West Coast and 35 days for those goods to get to the East Coast, which means that goods that were ordered back in March, some of those goods, bulk amounts of those goods have not arrived yet. You'll start to see a real drop-off in trade volumes at West Coast ports starting probably next week. and continuing into the first week of May. That's when you'll really be able to see the impacts of trucking and, blank sailings back to Chinese ports because they don't have any goods going the other way either.
But again, it remains to be seen on whether, how long this is all implemented anyways. I heard it well described earlier in the week on the 21st that what we were experiencing was a buyer's strike. People don't want to buy. They're sitting on the sidelines. And, we've seen a lot more activity towards the end of the week. But because of the uncertainty, it's just a lot of people don't want to enter the market. In fact, I heard some commentators talking about how they had minimal equities exposure at this point, which I think is somewhat of a mistake.
You could argue that it is. The worry here that we're seeing in the markets now is you're seeing a lot of comparisons to 1980s Japan when they became Japan's always been somewhat protectionist, but protecting their home industries in those decades and kind of a failure to innovate in a lot of ways, in addition to just, the decades of just malaise with their currency, didn't do them any favors. The paradox of tariffs is that, the idea with protectionism is you're protecting homegrown industries from foreign competition. And I've said this before, when you protect companies from competition, you're not really doing your total market any favors. It means you get essentially homegrown monopolies where they don't have to innovate and they don't have to do the thing that their people are doing abroad.
It's like I was listening to somebody on Bloomberg that was talking about, okay, what's the idea? Like, is the end goal here we talked about this before, but manufacturing. And, he pointed out that back in, the 60s, 22% of the U.S. Economy was manufacturing. And today it's about 8%. And it's not really because of job loss. It's because of productivity. Our ability to do more with less labor is so substantial. So even if you bring back, some of those jobs.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that if anybody listening to this has seen the charts on social media about, which usually the chart is a chart of total manufacturing as a fraction of total employment. If you look at those graphs, they're somewhat misleading because in part, in recent decades especially, manufacturing as a proportion of total employment has declined, not because manufacturing jobs have been lost, but because other jobs have outgrown manufacturing, and manufacturing has become more efficient. So it's misleading to say that, manufacturing has done nothing but decline in the U.S. Decades upon decades.
And he had pointed out that, what do you think when you think of a manufacturing powerhouse? What do you think of? And you might actually think of Germany or Japan for some manufacturing, and they have about the same exposure of manufacturing that the U.S. does. We've actually done a good job with manufacturing in the U.S. It's just that we're not reliant upon that industry.
Right. We're a very diversified economy. It's very, very rare for an economy to be as large and as diversified as the U.S.'s is. The U.S. really is an outlier in the statistics. Our per capita GDP is on par with a lot of countries that some consider to be total statistical outliers because of things like tax haven status. Like, you ever look at the per capita GDP of somewhere like Luxembourg or the UAE or something like that, and it's way, way up there. But a lot of that, or like Ireland. Ireland is a commonly cited example of a tax haven pushing up per capita GDP in a way that is somewhat misleading if you look at median and stuff like that.
Do you think the U.S. could be a tax haven for international people?
In total? The U.S. has an extraordinarily low tax burden on a per capita basis.
I'm just thinking,
for an economy of its size.
What if the U.S. marketed itself as a tax haven? Would that be a boon or a plus for the U.S. economy?
We kind of already do. The U.S. is somewhat unique in that our tax policy taxes our citizens abroad as well as domestically, which is part of why we kind of get away with such low tax rates. Some countries, for example, in the EU, if the second you move your money abroad, the funds have difficulty taxing them. So we kind of already are a tax haven, especially if you consider certain states that have no income tax or no wealth tax or very lax corporate laws. Like Wyoming, you don't even know who owns most LLCs. We kind of are naturally a bit of a tax haven just because of our federal system, where you go to specific states and your tax burden winds up being a lot lower than in other jurisdictions of the U.S. where your tax burden can actually be quite high. Portland, for instance, has some of the highest tax rates in the nation.
Yeah,
higher than New York City, I believe, last I checked, which is
higher than
nuts.
Manhattan, being in the financial district. And I don't know if that's. I wonder if that's true today, but I don't think they've decreased the tax rate.
You know, one of the problems of Portland is they have local municipal income taxes in the metro area. I would argue that a lot of states have this issue where they've like capped property taxes and then they've shifted the tax burden onto sales and income tax, which I don't believe. I mean, I can get into this if you want to on tax policy, because if I get back up, there's a question of tax efficiency if we want to talk about this.
Yeah.
And the idea of taxes is you pay for public services that would either otherwise not have an incentive to be funded in the private market, or you're providing a service where the whole of society benefits, right? So the society gets a return on its investment. And then also, of course, just basic human services and defense and stuff like that. And you have to take out some amount of taxes no matter what. It's you just can't run a society without it. I don't care what the libertarians say. You're not going to do it. You have to have taxes of some sort.
I'd like to find a way to do it, though.
It would be nice. And we do seem to keep pushing closer and closer to that with every passing decade. We get a little bit more efficient.
Well, here's my argument is that conceptually, taxation is theft, but there's a certain amount of justifiable theft that in order to have a functioning government, you just have to accept. But in principle, it is still theft, but you've just justified it as a society in order to function.
Oh,
because
yeah,
the
of course.
alternative is basically anarchy. And so I'm okay with justifying some theft from my income.
Right. So, I mean, the question becomes then, how do you best justify the tax?
Yeah.
What is going to be the least damaging way to do a tax in order to fund these services that everybody agrees that we need to have? And in some cases, you want to prioritize stability in the tax. So this is why people love sales taxes. The government oftentimes uses sales taxes to try and get services to like self-fund themselves. Like, for example, I know that the road, like, for example, really common example, the gas tax is used to fund roads. Although roads, by and large, aren't actually fully funded from that. They have to pull from general funds usually. It's in principle a very stable tax, and that's a big reason why we've been able to expand and build out the highway system so effectively in the U.S. However, if you look at it on a purely economic impact basis, what taxes give you the most bang for your buck? The answer is you have a tiered system of taxes where you have the most impactful are always sales taxes. There are some taxes that you could argue are more impactful, but like the most impactful common taxes are going to be sales taxes.
And when you say impactful, you mean impactful to the citizens?
Impactful to just economic growth. So
Okay.
like for every dollar you tax, how much productivity is destroyed when you take out that tax? Because you are pulling money out of the system that could otherwise be spent on something else. And the problem with the sales tax is it directly depresses consumption. You are directly disincentivizing people to spend in a certain way, and oftentimes it comes with a whole bunch of unintended externalities, because once you tax some specific good, you encourage people to maybe use more of another good that could replace it. So you tax one particular kind of fuel, you incentivize people to use another kind of fuel unintentionally. This is why sales taxes are generally kind of fraught.
Yeah.
Now, a step down from that, you have income tax. And why do I say it's less impactful? Because income tax is, yes, it's impactful in the sense that it's money that could have been spent somewhere else, or could have been saved, or could have been done literally anything else. But the income taxes don't directly affect behavior in the same way that sales taxes do. And it's shown in studies that income taxes are less impactful than sales taxes, in particular because oftentimes income taxes are progressive, in that if you earn more, you pay more, and if you earn less, you pay less. And, I don't know if you know this, but when you're poor, usually you're a very, very good consumer because a huge proportion of your income just goes towards, buying basic necessities that you can't afford to not buy. So, when the government subsidizes the poor, typically there's also a little bit of a bigger multiplier effect on the economy because that money immediately goes back into the system.
Sure. I mean, you subsidize someone with more income and they're not necessarily going to buy or consume more or less.
Right. Because typically if you have more money and you get more money, you just save it, which isn't really bad either. It's just
that's another economic stimulation,
right?
Too.
It's another economic stimulation. It's a well of money that sits in your bank, or it can be invested in something, or the bank can lend it out. It is good to have savings, but the least impactful tax that a government can levy is usually property taxes. And the reason I say this is that property taxes are oftentimes, or taxes on economic rents generally. So, something where there's a middleman and the person that owns that particular resource is not necessarily the person that owns that resource is not necessarily obligated to reinvest in the asset they own in order to improve it. So they get that benefit without necessarily putting a whole lot back in, or they don't have to.
I should have known this was leading to Georgism.
Yeah, I am, of course, a notorious Georgist, but which I'm not going to get into because that'll get even more into the weeds. But the point is, if the idea is to minimize impact to your economy and your citizens, you should be taxing preferentially property taxes, then income taxes, and then sales taxes.
Sure,
although in practice, you really want all three in different situations.
And you get into other caveats where things become difficult, and that's a whole other story.
Right, and then your tax burden is different depending on how much income you have or what you own, or if you're importing, exporting for tariffs, which I would argue tariffs are only marginally better than a value-added tax.
In summation, I saw this funny video that was...
in summation, I saw this video.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
okay.
no. And let me get on my glasses and, but I saw this video that was, working late nights, it's all worth it when I remember who I'm doing this for. And the guy picks up a framed photo from his desk and he's, kind of sobbing a little. Then they pan the camera and it's a framed photo of the IRS logo.
Yeah. At the end of the day, we're all working for the IRS. Death and taxes,
makes
that's
it all
the only
worth it.
two certain things in life. It's, I bring this up because Portland is usually cited as having unusually high taxes. And part of that is literally just down to the fact that at a state level, we actually limit the amount of property taxes that can increase in any given year, assuming you haven't built something new, which in part kind of implicitly drains the city's potential revenues from property taxes, which they then need to make up in other ways, which I think is part of the reason why they've raised other taxes.
It's also a policy choice.
It's also a policy choice.
So,
I mean, Florida's talking about getting rid of property taxes, which I think is a terrible idea, but
it's interesting.
You can vote for that if you want.
What does China do where it's like they only tax new development or something as it's being developed and then never again?
That's a really fun policy, and I'm glad you brought it up because I almost forgot about it. What they do is...
That was what was it, Evergrande? The Evergrande scandal where everything blew up.
Scandal, yeah. That's basically what the outlet Strong Towns would call that is a growth Ponzi scheme, where you are constantly relying on new development to fund past services that you're providing. And
sounds familiar.
China takes this to the extreme. Like, you have to tax something, and we actually also do this in the U.S. It's called a system development charge, and they can be quite reasonable. If you put it in a giant building, it stands to reason they should share some of the burden for like building pipes, upgrading roads, and upgrading transmission infrastructure. But China takes this to the extreme where a lot of their municipalities only fund themselves through system development charges. Now, for the longest time, China got away with this because they had runaway growth where they were essentially bringing themselves up to the standards of living of the rest of the world, and they were able to basically get away with not taxing existing properties because there wasn't that much of a tax base to begin with. Now that real estate has slowed down in China, The question is, what happens when that system development charge trickles to a halt? Do you cut all the police services? Do you make people angry and raise their property taxes? And it's a whole political kerfuffle.
Yeah.
And that form of financing for our municipalities has been on the rise in North America as well. System development charges have risen quite substantially in the past few decades, which has the same problem as sales taxes, where it does discourage that particular activity.
Yep.
And it's also a really lumpy form of revenue because, as I said before, if you don't have development, you don't get system development charges.
Yeah, and people are developing in a good economy, and so revenues increase for the city. But when you need the city the most is when there's no new development, and so that leads us a bit to Chinese imports.
It does,
and I think a lot of people have seen there have been a lot of imports arrived empty-handed. Just big old carriers full of empty boxes.
Yeah. There's this fun thing that has happened since containerization where the containers themselves, for those that don't really necessarily understand how international trade works, because why would you? Containerized transport.
Neither does the administration.
Yeah, I suppose neither do they. But, how containerized transport has revolutionized global trade is that instead of having bespoke loading and unloading of ships containing all sorts of weirdly shaped and strange goods that may be perishable or may be non-perishable, where you'd have to have specialized longshoremen hauling things on and off of boats at the docks, you instead just have one singular standardized container that you put everything in that can be loaded and unloaded in fairly standardized processes. It's part of what's caused our ports to go way up in productivity. But what'll happen is that as a result, you now have these containers that are goods in of themselves. And you have to, if you have a deadhead trip, a blank sailing, a ship that is empty, and you can sometimes cause issues where a lot of goods are going in one direction, but not the other. So you have to somehow get those containers back to the other port where you're taking stuff out of, which comes at a cost to the shippers. And you have to basically treat these as a separate good that you are yourself as the shipper paying to ship.
Seems like such a waste, but if there's nothing to bring back that makes any monetary sense, you got to bring that back the containers.
Right, because otherwise the container cost will go up way big at the port that you're taking everything away from.
Yeah.
And you won't have enough containers to ship the other goods that are actually worth something. The fluctuations in this market, and that market, by the way, are a big reason why you sometimes see people say, hey, these containers are really cheap right now. We should use them for housing or something. And, that goes in and out of fashion because of that. But, these ships, you're really going to start to see a lot of blank sailings and drops in port activity come the next week or two as you see those. It takes 25, 35 days to get from China to the U.S., and it's been 25, 35 days since a lot of those big tariffs went into effect. So depending on how long these shipment restrictions stay in, combined with the ship fees, you could wind up with a situation where, suddenly a lot of our cheap imports cut off in May, and they don't come back for like a month after you change your policy, which means, maybe no cheap American flags or fireworks on the 4th of July this year.
Yeah. No cheap stuff from Temu.
No cheap stuff from Temu.
The administration is talking about potentially making a deal with China, which is interesting. It has been a positive piece of news for the market. Although there's been mixed reports because Trump came out and said, oh, we're nearing a deal. And then President Xi said, what are you talking about? Yeah. We've done no such thing, which begs the question. I don't know if I trust the news outlet from either of them. I think they're probably both posturing, and they probably are coming to a deal.
I would agree. There's probably some sort of back channel talk going on.
Yeah.
But you really just don't know.
It's hard to know.
And in the meantime, countries where there's been less controversy, even though there is now that 10% tariff in place globally, for example, certain Mexican and Canadian goods are exempt because of the North American USMCA agreement, which, by the way, fun fact, has a different acronym depending on what country you're talking about.
It does?
Yeah. If you're in Canada, they start with CA. It's like the CA-US-U Mexico or something agreement,
I see.
and then Mexico, it's the Mexican-US-Canada agreement or something like that. So each country put their own name first to their own citizens as a kind of marketing thing.
Yeah, they couldn't stick with NAFTA.
No, they couldn't stick with NAFTA for whatever reason. I heard someone speculate that if Al Gore had won the election in 2000, by the way, we would have like a North American version of the EU customs union by now, which I thought was a wild take.
I think that's a difficult prediction. I mean, I think it's something he would have wanted, but I don't think Congress would agree to that.
No, probably not. I mean, you could always play coulda, woulda, shoulda with like, oh, what if this happened? What if that happened? And it didn't. So we don't have that.
Yeah.
But Latin American production.
Yeah, and I was going to mention there's been the shift in Latin American production, but I also saw that California has overtaken Japan as the third largest economy. What was it? Yeah,
wow.
the fourth largest economy in the world.
Oh, that's wild.
And Germany overtook Japan as the third largest economy in the world in 2023. So now it's Germany, California, then Japan.
Oh no, Japan! You did so well for so long.
Yeah.
People forget that even with the lost decade, Japan is a beast.
Japan is a beast. I mean, I assume, I didn't even look at the list. I assumed the U.S. is number one and China is number two.
Yes, you would be correct. U.S. number one for now.
USA.
But California is a strange place. They're incredibly wealthy, and it's so expensive to live there, even if you're local. I sometimes wonder if those GDP metrics are propped up just by the fact that housing is so expensive down there. So you can't afford to not be poor in California.
I mean, the West Coast as a whole is just more inexpensive than a lot of the country, though.
More expensive? Yeah, I would say so. It feels like it, certainly from where I'm sitting. Although I will say Oregon's economy in particular has lagged the rest of the West Coast.
Sure.
Which is, kind of true to form historically. There was a period of time where Portland did rival Seattle in terms of size and economic heft. For example, I don't know if you remember. Well, of course you wouldn't remember. Neither of us were alive back then. But
I remember. Pepperidge Farm remembers.
Yeah. Back when Boeing had a slump, and I believe it was the 70s or the 80s, they did a huge series of layoffs. And back then, Seattle's economy in particular was way over-reliant on Boeing. It was essentially an overgrown company town just built for Boeing. And there was a billboard that went up that said, "Last person leaving Seattle, please get the lights," which has since been repurposed all over the country whenever there's an economic slowdown in a specific city, like Detroit used it.
Yeah.
Other countries have used it occasionally. There's a lot of regional variability in the U.S. And here on the West Coast, we were very reliant on exports and imports. Exports to and imports from Asia, I would say. Our number one trading partner, I believe right now, here in Oregon is, and actually I pulled it up on my phone just for this occasion so I would know. Our number one import partner is Japan.
And this is from OPB, so it is reputable.
Yeah, exactly. As long as they haven't cut funding yet. Here in Oregon, our top imports are Japan, Taiwan, Canada, then China, then South Korea, then Israel, Germany, Singapore, Malaysia, then Mexico.
And that's imports?
That's imports.
Yeah.
So, your adjacent neighbors are pretty much always going to be your top import-export partners.
Oh, sure.
Just because of physical proximity.
And if I'm not mistaken, Oregon is the number 2 exporter of hazelnuts in the world next to Turkey.
Yep, that's true. We call them filberts here.
Yeah, but you get less money for filberts.
You get less money for filberts, funnily enough, if you call them that. Nobody knows they're called filberts unless you live in Oregon. And more, like fewer local Oregonians even call them filberts. It's mostly just the older generation. You know, the same guys that say crick instead of creek. So
it's just not a ring to filbert. Hazelnut is there's prestige in hazelnut.
I gotta tell you, hazelnuts have had some pretty unfortunate names in the past that I am not going to repeat.
You're not thinking of hazelnuts. That's a different one.
Okay, well, in any case, let's not go over the historic anachronisms of some of those names that would get us in trouble. But these trade wars are going to impact us, and it's been impressive that Oregon has actually been leading the charge on kind of trying to fight these tariffs to a degree.
Yeah.
It's because we're so overexposed to import-export tariffs. Being coastal, having ports, even though our port is called Portland, not Port C, Oregon is the lead plaintiff in a 12-state lawsuit currently against the administration for trying to overturn the tariffs on the grounds that the administration did not properly declare, like there's no they're improperly using the act that Congress delegated their tariff authority to the president for, essentially arguing that only Congress has the power to levy taxes unless there's some sort of emergency, which they're arguing there is not.
Well, I mean, the constitutional power of taxation is expressly given to Congress.
Right. But Congress does have the right to delegate that authority.
Yeah. Is this separate from the one that was launched by those small businesses?
I believe it is separate.
Oh, okay.
It's I think it's a good argument. It is kind of the reasoning in reading about the lawsuit is kind of contrived that the administration used as justification for all these tariffs. And the fact that they've just been coming on and off has been really not working in their favor from a legal argument. What'll be interesting is that if the courts did rule in the state's favor and they took off the tariffs, the damage has pretty much already been done for a lot of those trade partnerships. Even if the tariffs were totally removed at this point from especially China, you're probably going to see a lot of those retaliatory tariffs stay on.
I don't know if it would be good if it just cold turkey went off. I almost think it's like we're in too deep. You kind of got to walk yourself out of it.
Yeah, I kind of fully agree with that sentiment. It's at this point, like this is what kind of makes tariffs so terrible is that
tariffable.
They're taxes that involve a third party you have no control over, that you both have kind of a prisoner's dilemma of, okay, if I remove my tariffs first and they don't, suddenly my exports are at a disadvantage, but their exports are not. So there's an incentive where, okay, we have to both remove them at the same time, and we both pinky promise that we're not going to put them back in place. And then if one party doesn't do that, it's a whole thing. So this is why it takes so long to get tariffs off in the first place.
But the thought process is everybody loses, but I lose less if I win.
It's kind of tariffs are kind of a race to the bottom, and this is kind of why we rejected protectionism following World War II.
What was
in the first place.
The name of that accord in 85? The Plaza Accord.
The Plaza
That's what it was.
Accords, yes.
Yeah, they all, the G5 countries, they all agreed to, at the same time, devalue U.S. currency by selling off their stockpiles in order to devalue the dollar, so that it stabilized trade imbalances. And this has been praised as a really effective event towards fixing those perceived issues without protectionism.
Yes.
That maintained those trading relationships and partnerships, but right-sized it.
It did require international cooperation, however, like extensive international cooperation. The other thing to consider on that, too, is it was in part blamed for some of the slowdowns later on because it in part made exports from those countries less competitive relative to the dollar. So that Plaza Accord was actually partly blamed for the loss. It was just one in a series of issues that Japan had, but that was in part blamed for the lost decade that Japan had.
Yeah.
So it's not entirely without its faults.
And it was, funny enough, agreed upon at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, a hotel once owned by the president.
Oh, by Trump?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It wasn't Nakatomi Plaza?
It was not. It was
Didn't throw Die Hard off the top or whatever his name is?
They did not.
Oh, okay.
It's not Christmas time yet. We can't talk
about Die Hard. It's getting warmer. It's a Christmas movie. We'll listen to this again come Christmas time, and then it'll be appropriate.
Yeah. Speaking of Christmas, I'd like to get myself a great Christmas present, and it's the Slate EV that we just saw that came out that they did some press releases on. It was. I mean, it's this under 20,000 modular. Interesting vehicle.
There's a company, it's famously backed by Bezos, according to certain sources, where they have come out with a modular electric vehicle truck. That if you can imagine like a Japanese K truck, it's like an American version of that. But what makes it so unique is that for so long, the trend in American car manufacturing has been to become bigger and bigger and bigger, so that A, you meet the demand for those kinds of cars, but also B, you come under the light truck exemption, so that you don't have to meet restrictive safety or emissions requirements. That's fundamentally why American trucks have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. They're mandated by law essentially to do so, because if you build a sedan, you get taxed out the wazoo.
I always thought it was because we were compensating.
I mean that too, but what makes this unique is that EVs aren't really subject to that same light truck requirements, or it's famously called the chicken tax.
Yeah,
because originally it was built to exempt, like farmers that had trucks that had work trucks. From EPA emissions rules.
But this one comes in at bare bones. I mean, it doesn't even have infotainment. It has basically a dock for your phone, and you can upgrade it to a dock for a tablet. And they don't even give you the tablet. And it doesn't. You have to upgrade for speakers, or you can just put the speakers in yourself. It's built to be worked on yourself. And some of them look like trucks. You can do versions that look like like a little blacked out Range Rover,
a Jeep,
yeah,
with like a roll cage, and like the doors come off,
a sand buggy type of deal. Very intriguing. I wonder if they will deliver on their promises, because it's a similar, and I know you might disagree with me on this, but it's a similar outlook that Canoe EV had, which I still really like, but they have failed to really ramp up the way that a Rivian has.
I think this is better than that, and I want to say this because it feels like a little bit of a new manufacturing paradigm. Part of the reason they're targeting very, very quick cash flow positive on their manufacturing, and the way they're able to do this is by essentially creating as bare bones of a product as they can and having all the customization happen aftermarket. So, oftentimes car companies will have to have whole separate factories built specifically for like the painting of their cars. It's no simple thing to evenly and consistently apply a coat of paint to aluminum or steel. They get around this by just having a all plastic exterior that's the same color throughout. It's all, it's like Henry Ford. You can have any color you want so long as it's black. Though in this case it's gray.
And I noticed all the quote unquote paint colors, it's all wraps. So they just wrap the car for like $500, which is not too bad. It's apparently really easy to wrap this car.
To be fair, it's not a bad business model. I mean, it's a little bit shocking to have no infotainment system in a modern car. That's crazy. That's very risky, I would say.
I mean, at first I went through the customization and I thought, this is dumb. I want an infotainment system. But then I thought, even if it had one, I would still use my phone.
Yep.
So
why?
I guess that makes sense. And if you do want one, you can just get like a, some tablet that's your dedicated one, but it's logged into everything you have. I mean, it makes sense. I get it. They save money on it, and it's not most of the infotainment systems suck anyways.
Oh yeah. And car companies are constantly skimping on infotainment systems. And And it's not like they're leaving intentionally the space to put in a sound bar or some more advanced system if you want. But the real genius of this is that the reason they're designing it to be worked on and repaired easily is in part because they're trying to limit the number of warranty claims on the car. The idea is by stripping it down to its basic components at the factory, you not only simplify the manufacturing process, but you also make it easier. You also reduce the number of post-warranty claims. Apparently, 70% of warranty claims come from the infotainment system alone.
Because they, again, suck.
Right. Again, so why not just let the customer choose what kind of quality they want in their infotainment system?
It's true. You know, and I saw one of the customization things you can do. If you don't want to put in speakers, you can just get a little hook that goes in the center, and you can latch on a Bluetooth speaker.
Yeah.
Which honestly,
yeah.
I mean, there's some really good Bluetooth speakers. That's not bad. I definitely have had a car that had speakers went out and just used a Bluetooth speaker, and it was fine.
Yeah, and it's it'll be interesting to see if the American public does respond to this kind of car, because the other interesting component of this is that allegedly, according to the company Slate, their supply chains are very U.S. focused. So they're not necessarily having a bunch of complicated supply chains for imports for various parts, which, if true, would make them more competitive compared to even a lot of regular car companies for their luxury brands.
Especially under 20 grand for a truck.
That's crazy. That's a great price. Now, granted, that's the base model with no infotainment system, no perks, no wraps, and the battery only has about 150 miles of range if you don't go spring for the larger battery.
Yeah, but that's not bad, and presumably you could add stuff on. If it's modular, you could just add stuff on as you go.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and actually competitive. I will be following this company. If they're profitable right from the get-go, they're going to have a huge competitive advantage.
Yeah. You know, switching subjects a little bit, I thought it was interesting. You know, we've seen a lot of earnings come out, and Google's first quarter earnings, they made $8 billion in profit because of their investment in SpaceX. And it's just that's a massive proportional increase from an investment that Google has made. $8 billion from rockets.
Yeah, just from the rockets. Which is crazy. I've been saying that a lot. A lot of things we're talking about this week are crazy. I have a soft spot for rocketry. I got a soft spot for space. I grew up reading a lot of science fiction novels. The real cool thing about SpaceX is they started out as just a rockets company launching for NASA, but with their Starlink program, they have a cash flow machine that is throwing off profits left and right. And they have to, the Starlink is a constellation. So they've got thousands of satellites in orbit at any given moment, and they're treated as disposable. So they're at a very low altitude, which means they're actually technically orbiting in the atmosphere, which means their orbits do what's called decaying, and they fall back to Earth after a few years. It's part of how they mitigate against space junk. But what that means is they're constantly having to replace these suckers. So they've got a constant machine of, hey, we're making a lot of money off of selling the satellite internet service to people. And we have to constantly have these launches. So there's a reason to exist. And nobody else can do this launch cadence over and over and over again because they perfected the reuse of at least the first stage.
Yeah.
And, regardless of your opinions of Musk, I want to be clear here. Like, this is just an awesome business model. A lot of people like to denigrate SpaceX as being like just supported by the government or something like that. I don't really buy that. It's kind of a nonsense take.
They get some subsidies, but it really doesn't matter.
No, they do get actually substantial subsidies, but they're really a business in their own right now. Oh, SpaceX alone has at their launch cadence launches a factor of magnitude larger number of rocket launches than most countries, pretty much any country.
I mean, a lot of people have seen that freaking the globe where it shows all the satellites that SpaceX has in orbit, and it's a time lapse, and it's just an insane amount of satellites that they have exponentially more than most governments.
Yep. And now people in the middle of nowhere can get decent internet. If you're in the backwoods of the Yukon, you can get almost as good a service as somebody in a major city, which is really novel. Or if you're in Africa or somewhere like that, it's isolated islands like St. Helena or Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic.
Yeah. We were actually pitched a chunk of SpaceX.
I remember that. Yeah.
As much as we loved the idea of being an investor in SpaceX, the problem is there's no off ramp. I mean, people are just in it because of at the time they were in it for Musk and the whole thing. And basically it's going to be private forever. So they might have made $8 billion on that investment, but where's the exit? That was my concern about investing in SpaceX.
This is my problem with private investments in general, is that as an investment fund, we are always looking for liquidity and off ramps and what happens if one of our partners suddenly needs to liquidate or something like that. We just, like, as an individual, you could hold it just for the prestige, but you need to know what your exit is going to be. And with SpaceX, I just don't know what it is unless you're selling into the secondary market, which you have no idea if you're going to have to take a massive discount. So there's no price transparency.
Yeah. I think that's a unique problem with SpaceX, because usually in order to have a successful round with private equity, you have to have an off ramp, but they're an outlier.
Yeah.
They can just exist for the prestige.
Yeah. I mean, you could just hold that for the prestige. They're making decent amounts of money. And I remember, I think it was, JP Morgan that came out with that estimate that they were going to make like $125 billion a year off of Starlink alone. That program is single-handedly financing their Starship program, along with, of course, subsidies from Musk selling off Tesla stock, which has not been doing great recently, by the way.
No.
But interesting tidbit, since we're on the subject. SpaceX has their Falcon 9 rocket, which is you divide rockets into multiple stages because, the rocket equation is a terrible to deal with. You have to ditch mass just to get up higher with secondary stages that you then have to have separate engines that you light. What SpaceX does with their Falcon 9 is that it's a multi-stage rocket where only the first stage, the candlestick, is recovered, and the secondary stage, which you have on top, like imagine this, where you have the first and second stage on top. This first stage is recovered, and then the second stage dies, blows up. It drops. They recover the fairings, which is like the covering on the top, but it's really not that big of a cost. What they have with Starship, and the reason that it's great from an economic perspective, is that they have the candlestick, the first stage, that they're going to recover, and then they're also trying to recover the secondary stage up top, which is the Starship portion here. And I see a lot of people wonder why they're throwing away these rockets, and there is a point to it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
With this iterative design process. I do like watching them blow up, though. It's fun.
Yeah, always nice to see stuff blow up.
But if they get that flowing, the reason I mention is that if they get that working, then their launch cost per kilogram will go down even more, and they can launch even more and bigger satellites. And the flywheel starts running faster and faster.
And then they can get into exploiting minerals on asteroids.
You joke, but that could happen.
I mean, that would make a boatload of money if you could actually feasibly do it.
You want to talk about the economics of asteroids? Do you want to get into that right now?
Next time. On that note, I think it's about time that we get to this day in financial history. What do you think?
This day in financial history. You heard it first.
Take a sip of the Celsius.
So what happened, Quinn? Regale us with a tale of, I don't know, people getting in fights on the Italian trading floor again or something.
Yeah, you guys ought to listen to the last one. There was a lot of fights in it. So I didn't have one story that I wanted to mention, but incidentally, I did notice that it's not today, but the same month, April 1507, was the first time that the term America was actually used on a world map. And that was by a German cartographer, Martin Waldseemüller, however you pronounce
it. Waldseemüller? Müller?
Yeah. So just thought that was interesting.
Now, wasn't America? I thought America was a cartographer. Did he just reference America from like another? Because
Well, I believe that was America Vespucci. The origin is debated, but I believe this was the first time it was listed as a location.
that would make sense. It kind of reminds me of Oregon because the origins of Oregon are shrouded in mystery as well. We're not quite sure what Oregon itself as a term means.
Right.
As far as we can tell, it was either the name of a river or just straight up made up.
Yeah. But, and I have a couple of things here, so bear with me. Bear with me here. So in 1932, amidst the Great Depression, on April 25th, again, 1932, Greece made the bold decision to abandon the gold standard. And this move aimed to stabilize the nation's economy by allowing currency devaluation, making exports more competitive. And it was significant because a lot of countries during this period were trying to combat economic downturns, the Great Depression. And in Greece, it was ultimately a cabinet decision, but it was driven by pressure from the Bank of Greece because of a real-time collapse in the monetary reserves.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, I guess you can't have much of a gold standard if you don't have any gold to put up against it.
They on that day they took emergency measures. They suspended foreign debt payments.
Ooh.
They officially devalued it was called the drachma by leaving the gold standard, and then they imposed capital controls to prevent massive currency outflows.
Ooh.
And the drachma plunged in value against major currencies. Greek exports, especially agriculture, boomed almost immediately. And inflation rose, but not uncontrollably. And the kicker is the debt owed to foreign bondholders was effectively reduced by devaluation, angering foreign creditors, but stabilizing Greece domestically.
Oh, that's hilarious. So the debt holders actually got screwed.
Yeah.
We've only been a debt...
And that's not the first time Greece has screwed its debt holders.
I gotta say, though,
Won't be the last.
Necessity is the mother of invention, and what a hell of an invention that was.
Yeah.
I mean, I've talked about this before. Currency is a very human invention to very human problems. You need to exchange value, and it's not always efficient to tie those exchanges of value to something that does have some sort of inherent value, like a commodity, because you're then tying your currency to the fate of whatever this commodity is, which can be very inflexible. I mean, like you find a gold mine and inflation goes up. Right. They argued in the 1800s that the only reason the economy was able to function efficiently while a lot of people were on the gold standard was because a lot of gold mines were found in South Africa and Australia, which allowed the money supply to increase.
Right. And I have a couple more things that are interesting with currency here. But it freed monetary policy for them, that they could print more drachmas, stimulate the economy, and they survived the Great Depression better than a lot who stayed on gold longer, like France, for example.
Old habits die hard.
And it was a template for smaller nations trapped by rigid gold-linked currencies and crises. Now, they basically just defaulted on everything. But it helped them save the economy. So in the end, that's what matters for domestically.
As financial professionals, I really value the utility of bankruptcy. It's important to have a system in place so that A, you can negotiate with your creditors, and then B, you're not thrown into like debtor's prison when you owe money, because that's not good for anybody.
And it frees up capital that's tied up that would be tied up for a very long time, even if it's less than anticipated. You free it up for other purposes,
right?
More productivity.
It reduces rent-seeking behavior, is what I would say.
Yeah,
into very destructive rent-seeking behavior.
Now, the other couple of items that I have here is actually a birth and a death.
Oh,
and
on the same day, I presume, right?
April 25th.
Okay,
not the same year, but.
I was about to say that's a hell of a reincarnation you found there.
Yeah. No. Actually, you know what? It does kind of line up.
Okay. No. Well, continue. I want to hear this.
Actually, it doesn't quite line up. It can't be reincarnation. But
darn.
April 25th, 1874 was the birth of Guglielmo Giovanni Maria Marconi, first Marquess of Marconi.
And I really feel bad if there are any Italians listening to us here. I would butcher it. I would butcher it too. I'm not trying to put you down.
Don't read this. This is supposed to be a surprise.
All right,
Come
okay,
on. What are you doing here? So he was. Yes.
I don't like that. Continue. We gotta say, get it out.
And so he's obviously Italian, electrical engineer, inventor, and politician, known for creating the creation of a practical radio wave-based wireless telegraph system. And I mention him because his business ended up being a very influential company that was publicly traded in the U.S. and eventually bought out by, I want to say, General Electric. So he's credited as the inventor of radio, and he, the 1909 Nobel Prize in Physics with Ferdinand Braun. But what was kind of interesting, so this actually ties into the Titanic, because they were one of the first ships to utilize his technology, and he was credited with saving the people that did survive the Titanic. And funny enough, he was offered a ride on the Titanic, but he didn't take it because, as his daughter recounted, he decided to take a different one because he liked the type. I forget what it's called, stenographer, some kind of typing machine, because he had a lot of work to get done.
Oh, okay.
So he didn't like the fancy one.
He didn't like the fancy one. He wanted the old-fashioned one, not the one he. Yeah. But
Britain's Postmaster General summed up, referring to the Titanic disaster, that, quote, "Those who have been saved through one man, Mr. Marconi, and his marvelous invention." And eventually he went on to, and this is timely, he created the, what was it called? He set up Vatican Radio for Pope Pius XI.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, interesting guy.
Our Holy Father on the holy airwaves.
Exactly. And, I found a death on April 25th, 1919. And that was Augustus D. Juilliard.
1919. Was that during the war? Or was that just after the war?
Depends which month the war ended.
Okay, continue.
So this was an American businessman and philanthropist. He was actually born at sea. His parents were emigrating to the United States from France, and he ended up making a career for himself in New York City. His father was a shoemaker. They were both Huguenots. And
Huguenots, okay.
Yeah. In 1866, Juilliard moved to New York City, where he worked in the garment industry for a textile manufacturing company that produced worsted fabrics. When the company went bankrupt 7 years later, Juilliard founded his own corporation, the Augustus D. Juilliard Company, in 1874.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, continue. I recognize the name now.
Right. The corporation distributed textiles including wool, silk, and cotton. And in 1884, and this is where it comes into currency, Juilliard was the plaintiff in a U.S. Supreme Court case, Juilliard v. Greenman, challenging the law requiring acceptance of Federal Reserve notes as legal currency, and that challenge failed. And I thought it was interesting to look at what exactly he was arguing. And basically...
So, just to be clear, this is essentially a landmark case that established that the government can require the acceptance of federal notes as legal tender. That is essentially the precedent that this set.
It wasn't precedent necessarily because it was a failed challenge, but it did establish that
it reinforced it.
Yeah, it reinforced it.
Okay.
And essentially, so, yeah, they were challenging the issuance of greenbacks. And for those who don't know, greenbacks were issued after the Civil War as a fiat currency that weren't backed by anything. And as we talked about, people really didn't like the idea of a fiat currency.
Well, the Wizard of Oz came out of disagreements over the potentially using silver as backing for currency in the late 1890s. Fun fact.
Yeah.
Silver was replaced with ruby, and the yellow brick road is intended to be a metaphor for the gold standard.
Or so they tell us.
Or so they tell us.
And so they were challenging the Legal Tender Acts of 1862 and 1863, which were ultimately upheld. Essentially, what happened in the case is Augustus Juilliard sold and delivered 100 bales of cotton to Thomas S. Greenman for $5,122.90. Greenman tendered
$5,100 back in the day.
Yeah, Greenman tendered $5,100 in United States legal tender notes, and the rest in coin. But Juilliard would not accept the U.S. notes. The tendered notes were originally issued under, the acts after the Civil War, and in an 8-1 decision, resting largely on prior court cases, particularly Knox v. Lee and Parker v. Davis, they decided that the power of making the notes of the United States a legal tender in payment of private debts was interpreted as included in the power to borrow money and provide a national currency. So basically, they upheld fiat currency.
So basically, this guy was one of the last dying. This case was one of the last dying gasps of people that didn't want to accept U.S. dollars as payment.
Well, quite frankly,
in place of coins.
Quite frankly, I think he just didn't want to accept this guy's payment. I mean, It seems like he raised a kerfuffle about getting some paper money.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. He didn't like paper money, so he didn't accept it. And this court says, no, you must accept it for the payment of debts.
Yeah. Interestingly, I did see the dissenting opinion, by the way.
The one guy, dissenting opinion?
Yeah, because it was 8-1, Justice Field. And he basically challenged the court's interpretation of terms borrow and coin. And he explained that the term to borrow money was well settled in other instruments like corporate bonds or private contracts. And he said it would deviate the meaning of the term to borrow money. He asserted that the meaning of the term to coin money was certain, that it was metallic and whatnot.
Oh.
And essentially, what was he saying here? So he contended that allowing the government to make their notes legal tender would interfere with third-party contractual obligations, as third parties would be compelled by law to accept notes instead of coin, and that private corporate bonds could not require an amusement park to accept a bond in exchange for entry, for example.
Okay. I get his point here, but it sounds like he's essentially taking the side of the plaintiffs, or I guess the defendants in this case, where he's trying to say that the law does specify coins, so you guys ruling that the note that you can require notes actually screws up a lot of private contracts. Yeah. So this is a dangerous ruling to make. I mean, ultimately, it's the way things went. They're basically just saying that coin is like notes are coin and coin is notes, which I can understand that he took issue with, because I mean back then in practical terms they were not the same thing, or at least there was at least a distinction to be made, and this was not that divorced from the time period when those notes would have been originally issued. I mean, in 1911 the Civil War had been over less than 50 years. Yeah. So it's that's the equivalent of today us referencing something that had been invented. Let's see, it's 25 right now. So something invented in the 70s would be equivalent to what they're arguing over at this point. Not invented, but like put in place.
This was like a few years after they were issued, because he died in 1919.
Oh, what was the year of the court case?
That's a good question.
That's an important question, Quinn. I was surprised that was ruled
1884.
1884. So it had been less than 20 years since the end of the Civil War. This is the equivalent of a policy introduced in the mid-aughts being challenged in a court decision.
Which is not unheard of. I mean, his assumption, his assertion was basically that, what did he say? There is no this is a quote, there is no recorded word of even one in favor of its possessing the power that is notes as legal tender. Mm-hmm. All conceded as an axiom of constitutional law that the power did not exist.
So he's arguing that the power is basically being invented.
Yeah.
And it's you can't claim that there's a constitutional case to be made out of this. Well, I'm sure this will be very interesting to currency nerds everywhere.
Yeah, and he quoted, he cited many of the founders against paper money, including James Madison, who said, quote, "The pretext for paper currency, and particularly for making the bills a tender either for public or private debts, was cut off."
Okay. Well, people have always hated the idea that certain principles are actually in reality made up because their strength comes in part from the fact that people believe they're real. Why does gold have more value than fiat currency? And the argument is that it has some practical value attached to it. But I mean, really, it's all invented in the end anyways.
Yeah, it's all culturally fabricated.
Right. Currency is a very useful cultural invention that I'm very glad we have so that we're not exchanging milk for barley on the street.
Yeah.
So it's, a fraught history that happened in jolts and jitters to create our modern world, I would say.
So thanks for listening. This has been the Capital Call with the Millegan Brothers, and I am Quinn Millegan.
And again, I'm Drew Millegan.
And we will catch you next week. So until then, take it sleazy.
Stay hydrated.
And stay liquid.